today, guys. Welcome back, Athlete Builder Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Beebe. I'm in the library today. Even the bio alone on Kevin Vanderbush is 3 pages. So really excited to have Kevin on. A few things right off the bat. I was just talking to him a couple minutes before we got started, just going over a few things. Comes from a long lineage, and everyone in the family, all athletic, all overly intelligent, all overly disciplined, hard workers. So in a family of 5 kids, Kevin was playing sports in high school. He was a state champion. He's on the national kayaking team, would have been at the 80 Olympics were they not boycotted. Older brother played professional baseball. Other brother, Randy, played college sports at Michigan State. One sister was a basketball All-American. Another sister was a high-level high school athlete. Everyone in the family has at least a master's degree. One has 2. One has a PhD. A little bit about Kevin. 40 years teaching strength and conditioning at Ben Davis High School. Just recently retired. Founder of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Been with that institution ever since. Been on the board. Been speaker at regional conferences. Been speaker at national conferences. BA from Purdue, master's from Indiana. A couple other things about him. He's been a former Indiana State director. Most recently with the NHSSCA, they've been giving out awards to All-American athletes. They now put his name on the award. One of the coolest things I saw here in the bio, the program at Ben Davis has been visited by over 400 different high schools from the Midwest, including schools from Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, all over the place. If you look at just football alone, the big sport in high school and college, prior to 1984, when Kevin showed up, 11 winning seasons in 47 years, 1 sectional title. Since he was there, if you just kind of just sum it all up, he got everybody super strong, super in shape, super fast. You're looking at 10 state titles in 40 years, including a national title, a couple state runners-up. If you look at basketball, been in the Final Four 20 times. All the different sports in the school, 25 different state championships. I'm looking at some of the individuals that we have Super Bowl champions, people in the Grey Cup, Naismith Award winners, athletes in the WNBA, Gatorade Girls Soccer National Player of the Year, World Cup, more Super Bowl players, more WNBA players. So Kevin and his group encompasses the one word that we strive to do with the people we bring on this show, and we want people that make an impact on other people's lives mentally and physically. And unequivocally, Kevin and his staff over the years has continued to evolve and has continued to do that. We're lucky to have Kevin Vanderbush here today. Kevin, thanks so much for being here.
Appreciate it. I get the opportunity to share.
I see that you've spoken in a number of different places. You're continuing to make an impact. And for someone who just recently retired, you're already immediately still you're still lending a helping hand. So I appreciate that. The first question I had was it just a round number at 40 years, or how did you know that, hey, you know what, maybe 2024 is the year. Maybe this is the time for me to make a change.
Well, for quite some time, it was going to be, pretty much close to when Social Security hit. I'm turning 66 this year.
Okay.
Fortunately, one of my sons is single, is a doctor, and building a house. And he said, in transition, if you and Mom want to stay with me for a year or two before you decide where you want to build, you can do that. Well, that actually gave me another year of life that I can spend with my grandkids and do some other things. So I actually was able to get out 1 year prior to what I had originally planned on about 10 years ago. So yeah, it was one of those things where I felt like after 40 years, I did what I was supposed to do. I felt good about being able to walk away. I left it all on the field, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I was ready to have my own schedule. For 40 years, I've been scheduled year round. So, right. That was the decision.
Gotcha. Well, congratulations. And we were just talking that in Indiana, the week of July 4th is moratorium week. And most coaches really and families look forward to that because nothing really occurs. It gives you a little break and people look forward to it. But once that week ends, if you're retired, it's still moratorium week, right? So it kind of just rolls right in. How's your summer been going?
Well, my family had to adjust vacations around my schedule for 40 years. And the
Mm-hmm.
only time we could take a vacation was the week of the 4th of July, which is the most expensive week. So, for me, it's really been different, because once school let out, typically the next day I start in the weight room. And yeah, I mean, there's been some transition in moving, and after living in the same place for as long as I did, there's a lot more to it than I thought it might be. But no, it's been nice that I get up each day and I decide what I'm going to do.
Awesome. Awesome. Still active physically, I'm sure. One of the things that's I really was drawn to with your experiences, you played sports in high school at a high level, but kayaking is not a very common or popular sport. One of the sports I played a lot was racquetball, which is also not very common. But in Indiana, it's not a lot of water either, other than Eagle Creek. So, how did you get into kayaking and get to the national level? You said you took some years off from college to compete on the national circuit and for the team for Team USA. Talk about that for a minute. I'm really curious.
Well, my father was a high school principal in Michigan. And when we moved there in the early 70s, my sister was a couple years behind me. And back then, there weren't a whole lot of options for females athletically. And there happened to be a woman in town who had been on 3 Olympic teams. In fact, a bronze medal winner in Tokyo. And she had a house on the river, and she got kids started kayaking. So my sister went out. This is in junior high age, and said, I think you'd like it. So I went out, and then so I added a fourth sport, so to speak, to the repertoire, and started paddling out there, and really that sport led to the knowledge base that I think was most important for me when it came to strength and conditioning, because it was kind of a minor sport. Once I competed, throughout junior high and did pretty well with that, participated in high school. And once I went to the national level, I had to, talk to a lot of people about training methods, whether it was Olympic development coaches, whether it was college professors, whatever it was, because I had to understand more than a typical athlete would, because it was a minor sport. You didn't have a ton of coaches around.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, I really got into it in junior high, but then I played the high school sports, thought I might go on in either basketball or baseball, but then decided, I still have that, want to go to the Olympics, want to compete. So took a few years off and just trained year round. Went to Olympic development camps in the winter down in Florida. 1979, my partner and I were at that time were the fastest two-man kayakers in the country. When we competed in the trials that went to the World Championships, got an opportunity to compete in Germany, Denmark that year, and stayed on the national team, through the training camps in 1980. But once the boycott occurred, I had to get back to real life, and went back to college. So, it really was very developmental in me getting into strength and conditioning, because that background, was huge. And then having played baseball, basketball, football also helped, so that when I came, to Ben Davis as a strength coach, I could talk to people about endurance sports. I could talk to people about, hand-eye coordination. I mean, I'd played a number of different things, so I wasn't looked at as just fitting into one box.
Clearly not. If you're playing the main ones, which you did, football, basketball, baseball, that kayaking was completely different. What I like is neurologically, you're going to evolve even further because you're using your brain and your body completely differently than you would in the other sports. It gives you different perspectives, and your body has to grow and mature and strengthen in some areas, which again just translates to being another well-rounded physical athlete. So it's got to be the core strength alone, right? The shoulder strength alone, your back, you're going to be well set up for anything else that you're playing. So I'm sure it worked out great with the other sports in high school.
Yeah. I mean, and back then, I went to high school in the 70s. And so, I mean, high schools back then didn't have weight rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that I, competed in kayaking and, had a coach who had us doing some weight training, doing some medicine ball work, doing some other things like that, I was kind of ahead of the game in terms of physical development, as I went to high school.
One thing that I find very, very challenging is like, we at my gym, we work mostly with kids that aren't in high school, a lot of kids that are younger. And we have a few stragglers in high school, but most of them work with the high school strength coach. And we simply just try to be complimentary and just add a few things here and there that maybe they missed or didn't work on, like the kids didn't, or just want some extra help. But a lot of kids we talk to, they and their parents are saying, I don't really feel the need for the weight room. They're kind of anti-weight room. They want to just play a lot of their sport and their practices. And it seems that some of those sports seem to be gravitating that into that trend of developing kids that way. Is that making life harder for you strength coaches in high school and stuff? Is that you finding you getting pushback from people?
Well, I had a kind of a unique situation in Ben Davis in that the culture we developed was so entrenched that I didn't deal with some of the things some other people do because a lot of times the parents of my athletes were former athletes of mine. So once you kind of sell the program's been successful. You're not necessarily facing the same thing. In fact, most of the people coming in are really they've already bought into the idea that both the strength and the athletic enhancement routines that we do there are going to help their son or daughter. So I didn't fight that as much.
That's good.
And at our school, the kids who would look for anything outside would tend to look for more specialized training in their sport. Like we had kids that go and work with a linebacker coach, or kids that work with a DB coach or receiver coach and so forth, because they felt like they already had the strength and athleticism taken care of in our program.
Good.
And so it wasn't the same thing. Now, I know that, parents a lot of times think they know more than they do about what their son or daughter needs. And, all of them think that they're going to get them that scholarship, and there's a lot of, AAU coaches or club type coaches that, will guarantee those things regardless of the athletic ability. And kids start performing because they think it's about getting scholarships. And I think that's really wrong. But, I haven't had to deal with it as much as most. I do think it is a problem that, people feel like all you do is play the game. And I think they play too much and they don't do practice enough. They don't work on skill development as well as not working on just strength and athleticism.
Right.
And I think it becomes about playing games, and it starts way too early.
Yeah. When it comes to be about playing games at a very young age, it's, in my opinion, it's more for the venue to make revenue than it is for the overall development for the kids. The kids get better from practicing over and over and over again. It's 10,000 reps. Bruce Lee would say, I don't fear the guy that practiced 10,000 different kicks. I fear the guy that practiced one kick 10,000 times. And it's that repetitiveness and the learning. The kids they're so young, their brains aren't developed, their bodies aren't developed. It's that learning component that comes from just hours and hours of practice. And the strength piece. It takes a long time to build a 500 squat or 300 bench or knock your 40 time down. It takes a long time to build that and your running mechanics. It doesn't just, hey, this summer I'm going to start lifting and I'll be okay. That's not the way it's going to be. It takes that compound interest effect to really maximize the results from hard work. So when with the new retirement, what are one or two of the main things that you feel like I'm going to miss this piece?
Well, the thing I'll miss the most is that, when you're a high school strength coach, every single day you have an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of the student or the athletes you work with.
Yep.
I mean, I went into work with the idea of, put those in front of me. I can mentor, counsel, advise, and give me the words to say to make a difference. I mean, I repeated that over and over because each day I would look for those opportunities. And for me, it wasn't even just about the athletes. It was about also mentoring other coaches. Being a student of leadership, being a student of coaching, being a student of sports psychology, I felt like I had a lot to offer any of the coaches, that worked there, the athletic administration, other teachers, as well as the athletes. So, I mean, the thing I'll miss is that, every day I could come home and say, these were the times that I was able to make a difference with somebody. These were the relationships that I developed. So to me, that's the biggest thing I'll miss. Hopefully I'll find other opportunities, to still make a difference. I mean, if asked to present at conferences, I still will do that. I've thought about the possibility of writing articles. I'm not sure that I'd want to dive into an entire writing of a book, but I want to find some ways of sharing what I've picked up over the last 40 years.
That's great. And offline, I'll be asking you about. I just hosted the Athlete Builder Summit a few weeks ago, and we're going to have another one next year. So one of those asks will be coming your way about having you present and speak. So no pressure. When you talk about making an impact with other coaches, on our show prior, we just had we've interviewed Matt Cates, Penn High School, Aaron Miller with Northridge. Chad Dockery is a good friend of mine that's now the athletic director down at Wrights down in Evansville. Those are the three people that have been on this show, and the word they use with Kevin Vanderbush is the godfather of strength and conditioning. So I said, is that from like a Vito Corleone gonna beat your ass kind of guy, or is it from the knowledge, or is it a little bit of both? And they were just high praise that they come to the mountain, and the mountain gave them tons of strength and conditioning knowledge. So you clearly made an impact. So that was great having them on. They mentioned you, and I said, well, I've never met Kevin. I know Randy, and they said, well, give him a call. He's willing to talk to people.
Well, I was able to start in high school strength and conditioning in 1984. I mean, and back then, there were a lot of MAC schools that didn't have strength coaches. I mean, Boyd Epley just started the National Strength and Conditioning Association in 1977. So, I mean, it was only 6 or 7 years old at that time. So for me, I was fortunate. I came out of college at a time when a school like Ben Davis decided, just football coach at the time, had been at Army and been at Purdue, knew that strength and conditioning was just getting started. The school itself had just purchased some equipment. So it was just the perfect storm, because I had put on my resume that I could be a strength coach, not knowing that, would necessarily lead to anything. But so I was able to start before most schools even thought about it. And so as a result, when we start in 84 and, the football team, you talked about had previous, lack of success. And we got to where, we were at the state championships and, 5 out of 6 years in a row, and we're national champions. And it drew a lot of attention to our school. And so once one school gets something, whether it's field turf or whether it's a strength coach or whether it's a big weight room, other schools then feel like, okay, it's okay for us to do that. And then getting those visitors, schools looking to us. So as a result, the reason that whole Godfather thing is thrown around, because, I was the first.
Right.
And as a result, I think because of our successes, it opened the doors for a lot of other schools and a lot of other strength coaches, and they claim that helped them get their jobs, because we were successful at what we did.
That's huge. I'm originally from Ohio, and Ohio and Pennsylvania are known for being powerlifting type of states. And like to a T, I don't know if it's just the industry or what. Like I've called people up randomly, Mickey Marotti at Ohio State, Louis Simmons over at Westside Barbell. And to a T, every time I call someone, and I don't know these people from Adam, and I just say, hey, my name's Jim Beebe. I'm trying to learn more about speed work, or I'm going to be in Columbus. Can I come by and watch practice or observe or follow your coaches around for an hour or two? To a T, everyone said yes, every time. And I think that people are just so adamant that, hey, let's just make people better and stronger. So it occurs mentally and physically, and it takes a team. That I think this in the industry alone, this isn't my background. My background's finance and investments. It's a completely different industry, and sometimes not nearly as welcoming if you're a competitor. But these folks, for some reason, they just constantly say yes. And you'll hear them on their other podcasts. Yeah, I called this guy up, and they said, yeah, come on over, and let's dive into it and learn. And you got 400 schools showing up. That's just huge. I think it's just an indicator that people would like to make an impact and help each other in in the strength and conditioning world.
Yeah, I think in sport, a lot of times people feel like they're always competing with each other, and so they can't give up these secrets.
Sure.
But in strength and conditioning, we're one of the components. It's kind of like an athletic trainer sharing methods of rehabbing athletes. We're trying to get that athlete ready to compete, but I think it lends itself to sharing more, but also just kind of this industry. There isn't anything that anybody's coming up that's brand new. I mean, it's people are sharing stuff, that's been used before and refining it. So everybody learned from somebody. So I think there's much more willingness to share.
So I'll be 50 this year. When I was a kid, I was playing CYO ball in some rec league, and if you played well in baseball in the summer, maybe you made the travel all-star team and you got maybe another 30 days, maybe 6 weeks of games. You're playing with some better talent, you get some more practices, but that's it. And once summer's over with, it's the fall. So it's either, football or cross country or whatever. So that extra travel ball was like what separated people because no one else really got that. Well, when you come into '84 at Ben Davis, most of the world is not really lifting, like you said. Most of them isn't. So, Bill Gates is basically the first guy who has unlimited access out at Washington with a computer because his parents were professors. So he has all this access, and he's in this new industry that hasn't really developed yet, and he gets his knowledge a little bit before everybody else, just a few years. But he was able to ramp that up. So if you're the only one saying, hey, maybe you guys should get stronger physically, there's going to be a correlation from that and wins. And then you kind of like, well, here's the first guy, the pioneer, and look, it worked. It makes complete sense that it just kind of took off. I remember when we had our phone call a little while back setting up this recording, you mentioned that, hey, if I know that, let's say a football team hits this number, this total, squat, bench, clean. If it hits this number, there's going to be a correlation to wins and losses. Can you talk a little about that? Because if you can't squat the bar or bench the bar, you're so weak, you're going to get crushed. But, if you're hit this, at least this minimum number, this target, this total, all right, now we're in a discussion that we're strong enough to be able to handle the load on the physicality of the game. Can you talk about the research and how you guys came up with that and how, like, trial and error that, hey, you hit this number, there's some good correlation. We might have a winning season.
Well, when we first started, we were looking for ways to motivate the athletes. Mm-hmm. And so we decided that, we need to come up with some strength clubs, things that would allow them to set goals for themselves. So at that time in 1984, there wasn't a whole lot of data, high school kids.
Sure.
The only thing that was out there, the Bigger, Faster, Stronger program put out this chart that said, this is a all-American or all-state standard. And so we developed our clubs kind of with that in mind, thinking, okay, they've got some data, so these clubs should be fairly similar. So we came up with a 400-pound squat club, a 300-pound bench club, a 235-pound clean club. And, for them, they were saying all three of these are fairly equal. Now, I've found over the years that they're not close. It's like we can get 62 kids as a record for the 235 club, but only 42 in the 400-pound squat club and only 27 in the 300-pound bench club. So they're not equal. But we started with those three clubs as well as one that had been started at the school, which was benching, 200 for 10 reps, which comes out to about a 250-pound bench. Mm-hmm. And then we decided that we wanted an overall athlete, not just one that would do well in one of those three lifts. So we came up with adding those three numbers together, 400, 300, and 235, and came up with a 935-pound club, which is our power club. So we had those 5 clubs, and we kept track right from the beginning. And that first year we started in 1984, we didn't have a single kid that could meet the 235 and a single kid that could do the 935. We had 8 kids that could, bench 210 times. We had 2 kids that could squat 400, 2 kids that could bench 300. And those were the same 2 kids. So, that's all we had were 12 club members. The next year, got things going. We got up to 28. We thought that was big. Next year, we got up to 74. It went up, at that point. The following year, the 4th year, we were up to 78. We won the state championship. And as we look at it in the first 20 years that we're there at the school, if we got above 76 club members, in those 5 clubs. And a kid can be in more than one club. So the total. Our average record was 13-1. If it's below 76, our average record was 7-4. So we felt like there was a huge correlation between how strong we got and how effective we were on the football field. Now, we also did a football lift contest back then. We started that in the late 80s or so. And, we'd bring about 10 other schools in. They could bring their football players. And, we had bench, squat, clean. We ran the 40-yard dash.
Right.
Well, early on, when we competed, we could have gotten first, second, and third place, just by having the, different groups of kids and totaling the numbers. So we were that far ahead of the other schools at that time because they didn't have the big weight rooms. They didn't have a strength coach at that time. There was just football coaches bringing them in. So we knew that we were at an advantage. And, I think we overpowered a lot of teams. People talk about the fact that we were, stronger, we were more athletic, we were faster. So I think that, the physical development was way ahead of the game. Once we got to, past 2000, between 2000 and 2005, other schools, had gotten weight rooms, they've gotten strength coaches. And so, whereas before there was a big gap, the gap was closed. Now, I like to think we were always stronger than anybody we competed against, but we also, at that time, we needed a quarterback and running back, before we could kind of get by without having that star player, because just developmentally, we had guys that were physically stronger. The year we won the national championship in 1991, 10 of the 11 guys on defense were in the power club. So we're talking about even defensive back.
Wow.
So, the numbers each year give us a strong indication of what kind of team we have. Now, the numbers have grown because once we were able to get freshmen involved, because when we first started, it's a 10 through 12 high school. Freshmen were at the junior highs. But once we got freshmen lifting, the numbers jumped. Instead of having 30 to 35 in the 235, we had over 60 at times. Instead of having 20-ish in the 400-pound squat, we had over 40 a couple times. So one more year of lifting helped kind of explode the number of kids we had. But at the same time, you got to realize that you're only putting 11 on the field. So it helped us depth wise, and it helps us in terms of we do have injuries, that there's not as big a fall off for the next guy in line, but we're also competing against teams who, are climbing much closer to doing what we're doing in the weight room.
That's excellent. There's 2 points I like to make along those lines. One, I can't remember the video I saw. It's Nick Saban. I think he's at LSU, and he's brought in, and he just says, we only have X number of guys that squat 500 and X number of guys that bench 4. So even if we are really great at the skill positions, we're just going to get pushed around, right? And I can't remember what the actual number was and when he said it, but you have to actually be in the game. You can't just be this weak person, given what your sports demands are. So you have that piece locked in for essentially 15 years, 20 years almost. 2000, that's 16 years. One of the things we talk about on the show is that in the head, there's 3 different components: your mindset, your knowledge, your mindset of who you are, how you handle things. There's your knowledge of the sport. There's what comes out of your mouth and how you deal with teammates. Physically, there's your training, there's your nutrition, and then there is your recovery. And each one of those 6 things, if you can find a big competitive, that's my dog, sorry. If you can find a big competitive advantage, that's how you win. Walmart's the cheapest. That's how they win. So for the longest time, if you're simply the strongest and most athletic, even if you don't have a skill player, you're winning at the line of scrimmage all the time. So what we tell our athletes, or when I work with our athletes, can we find? Sorry about that.
Okay.
Can we find a competitive advantage in all 6, or at least one, right, where you can actually beat people because you're so good? Maybe you just study so much film that you are always in position better than everybody else. Or maybe you're the most selfless person on the team as a teammate. That's your competitive advantage. But can you find one for all 6? And your gap was so huge, you exploited it. I just love that piece, because that is essentially what a business is. you have your competitive advantage, and that's how you make a bunch of money, right? So if you guys are simply the most athletic, well, here we are, 25 state titles. Here you go. That's huge. So now that the gap closes, you're still tasked with the same thing. How can we get our guys stronger, more athletic physically? How can we get them to eat better? How we get them to be better teammates? How we get them smarter, at their sport? And you, as a strength coach, you're pouring all that into them. And I wrote down here that you spent a bunch of time on learning about the psychology of dealing with people, not just X's and O's and sets and reps and percentages. Can you talk a little bit about the psychology of dealing with these high school kids and getting them to perform?
Well, again, one of the advantages I had was that, when I competed in the World Championships in 1979, I saw that the East Germans and the Russians had sports psychologists. So very early on, I was kind of in tune with the idea that there's something out there in terms of the mental component, that the people who are really doing things the right way. So, I became kind of a self-taught sports psychologist, read everything I could get my hands on in terms of sports psychology, in terms of, and it branches out into, any kind of personal development, any kind of mental toughness, any kind of leadership. I mean, all these things to me were components that, as a strength coach, would add to my toolbox. And I felt like I'm in the best position to teach these athletes about mental toughness, about handling adversity, about setting goals. I mean, a number of things that a sport coach doesn't really have the time to deal with, because they're dealing with their X's and O's and their skill development of that particular sport.
For sure.
So I felt like that I needed to be, a student of the game. So as a result of that, our football coach, as an example, I mean, as it evolved over the years, they would have me not only, we'd run a 3-week preseason conditioning program. We called it co-captain's practice, but we were developing leadership. So I became that person that was out there with the whole team and with the co-captains, teaching them how to lead, teaching the team how to accept leadership. But at that same time, we talk about mental toughness. We talk about how conditioning transfers to what you do on the field. We had team sprints where they were timed. They didn't meet the time. Okay, how are you going to handle a turnover in a game? Are you going to start pointing fingers? Or are you going to, get together and do things? So everything we did, we related to how does this transition to making you a better athlete, making you better on the field or on the court. And I also like to throw in making you better at life, because, I think sport is the ultimate, teaching tool for life skills. So, the football coach would have me talk with kids on Saturdays. I was the first one that dealt with the varsity. We'd do a little bit of a workout, but then we'd sit down for half an hour and talk about the attitude, about the leadership, about what went on mentally. Eventually it worked into where, I'm talking to the team before the game. I'm, running the warm up. I'm the first person to talk to them at halftime while the coaches are getting together with the X's and O's. I'm talking to again before we start the second half. So, my job went from, strength, athleticism, so forth, but as to kind of a, so-called sports psychologist, motivator. Those things help us, and then I would also, again, get back to coaching the coaches, talk to them about the kind of things that they were saying to the team. We need to focus on, plays at a time as opposed, process versus outcome, things like that many of the coaches had not really studied. So they were too big on, we got to win a state championship, or, these are the best teams in the state. We got to, do this, as opposed to, let's play our best football. Let's finish the game knowing that we got better. So, it helped me in terms of working with athletes. It helped me in terms of working with coaches. I think that's a huge part. The mental part, I think, is one that's overlooked by some people still, which amazes me, because it should be pretty much commonplace now. But I think as someone in the strength and conditioning field, it's ripe for being able to do that. I mean, you got a captive audience when you're between sprints. Kids will listen to anything, to get a little bit more rest. But they're also, it's a lot easier to tell them about, hey, you went into this thinking you couldn't run 50, 40-yard dashes in a row, and make it through. But now you do it and you feel good about it. Think about how much more your body can do, and, teach them about how the mental aspect affects what the body can do, but as you're going through it, it's really easy to say, hey, your body wants to shut down right now. You got to be tougher than that. You got to win that, that space between your ears. that's going on. So, I mean, it's just right for teaching mental skills.
It really is, because the physical pain causes your brain to want to make a different decision, whether you're out of breath or you feel like you might vomit, or it hurts having 500 pounds on your back. It hurts. You got to brace up just to unrack it, right? So mentally, there's so many lessons to be learned, whether you're in the weight room or at practice or in the game or off it. The first question I had was 935 is a big benchmark number for your clubs. Do you have something similar as a benchmark that says, you know what, that kid's not a pussy. He's mentally tough. Here's how I know he can do this. He'll do this.
Yeah. When we first started, the numbers were high enough to where, okay, a smaller kid, would have a difficult time getting there. So in order to develop the program, we came up with things like benching your body weight 10 times, squatting 1.5 times your body weight 10 times. But we also, we tested vertical jump, we tested 40, we tested some other things that, would allow kids to set certain goals. But for us, we kept sheets on each individual athlete, which we listed all of the results. Bench, their squat, their clean, their 40-yard dash, their 10-yard dash, their vertical jump, their body weight. And for us, it wasn't about always just trying to reach these certain marks, to get these clubs. It was about making individual improvement.
Sure.
So, I did my master's thesis actually on the class, where I studied the percentage of improvement each 9 weeks in my class, replicated it 10 years later to see if we were getting the same type of results. And what I found was that, just the average athlete in my class, in the first year that they're in my class, each 9 weeks we test. Okay. So we're testing, 4 times during the school year. The average improvement is 6 to 8% each 9 weeks, the first year that they're in there. That's without, these, when you don't do a pre-test, or you do a pre-test and they jump a whole bunch. We don't do that.
Right.
The kids got to be lifting, over 2 months before we get any results at all in order to compare it with the next one. So it's 6 to 8%, whereas, next year it's, having been in the program longer, it's 4 to 6%. So, we know what those percentages are, but we're working with the kids individually saying, okay, this is the average. This is the range. This is how much some people can improve. So it's not about just making those clubs. It's not just about those numbers, but it's about individual improvement. And, finding out what those kids need in terms of, they need more speed. Do they need more endurance? Do they need more, jumping ability? Do they need more strength? Finding what's going to be best for them to be successful, and putting them in a position to do so.
Coaches, you said, will say, hey, we need to beat these teams, or we need a state title, or kid says, I want to be on the board. Those are all milestones. Those are all tangible one-day events. I hit this squat. I beat this team. I won this title. That's not really the goal, though, right? The goal is, how can I get this coach or this athlete to set up the process to get on the board mentally, to come in and be intentional and intense each day? How can I get the coach to reach out and develop the other coaches? Because, you want to win on Friday, but you get, 10, 12 games? That's it. You still got 52 weeks in a year. The real goal is, how do you get them to buy in that, hey, we're working on process goals here, being 5 minutes early to everything. Talk about that with kids, that those processes that aren't really that sexy to talk about, that being on time, staying a little bit extra, doing the accessories. That's where you make your big jump on your bench, because you did all your extra accessory work, because you did all the little things that build that up. Can you talk about that?
Well, we were big on developing culture. And part of the culture was discipline, and talking about discipline as a habit. So, kids weren't allowed to be late. In my class, if they're not in the locker room, kids are doing push-ups, kids are doing extra things. We just call them motivators, not disciplinary action. We're going to give you more work because you haven't got it figured out. But I really think that high school age athletes want discipline, whether they understand it or not. And I've had some that, come back 15, 20 years later that will say, a big part of what I learned, from you was discipline. At the time, I didn't know it, but I needed it. And, I was successful as a result of going through that and experiencing it. So, I think that part of it, is huge. But, the culture to me, or even things as simple as, in my weight room, you have to wear tennis shoes, you have to wear shorts, you have to wear a full t-shirt, because That's, a discipline. You're not going to come in with, cut off shirts because, it's not like we're just putting on a gun show. We're in there as a practice for a sport. You're not going to come in with your "Hey dudes" on your feet or your Crocs because that you're not an athlete. So little things like that felt like were important to develop that feeling of we've got to do those things, and then from there it's what do I need to do today to make myself better. And I tell kids when they wake up in the morning, okay, there's a number of choices you can make throughout the day. If each time before you make a choice, say, is this going to get me to my goal? And you've set up goals. You've set up long-term goals, but you set up shorter-term goals. And we talked to them about that. But if all choices are made based on something that they are looking ahead in terms of this is what I want to accomplish, then it makes decisions much easier. Okay, do I go out to fast food all the time? Well, is that going to make you a better athlete? Are you going to recover as well? Are you going to perform as well? Are you going to have as much energy? Well, no. And so if you've already determined that I want to be as good an athlete as I can, then when you go to make that choice, it's very easy because you're always putting in front of you that, how do I compare this to what's going to allow me to be my best self? When it comes to the actual, playing, I tell guys before the football game, before a basketball game or whatever it is, that I want you to finish this game feeling like you gave it your all. You went 100% on every play. You got better as a result of playing this game. And that's how we're going to measure success. We're not going to measure it on the scoreboard because the scoreboard a lot of times has to do with the other team. It could have to do with the referees. It could have to do with what things that are out of your control. What is within your control is you playing your best, you competing, you doing everything you can to be better at the end of this day than you were at the start. So, that's a big part of, to me, developing athletes and getting them to understand that it's not just about outcomes.
We talk about how that translates with life. Lilly's one of the biggest companies here in town. So maybe you're doing your job as best you can, but this drug does not get approved, and Lilly's numbers, their net income numbers don't reflect that. So they take a hit. There are things that are out of your control in all these organizations everywhere. And if you start focusing on those things that you can't control, I find nothing but misery. Personally, I'm upset. I'm worried. I'm anxious. I'm pissed. Right? If I can sit there, hey, these are my markers. These are my top tasks. I'm going to knock these out and then help my teammate knock out one or two of his. All right. These are things I can feel good about. I said, this is why our phrase is win the day. These are the things that we can work on today and get there. I think that's a great way to approach that and developing that culture that way that you guys had there. Every once in a while, you have someone that's different, right? I see NFL players, WNBA players, Super Bowl champions. You find some people are different. Some people are going to be different physically, right? Some people are going to just work harder, but they don't have it physically, right? And then you get the Peyton Mannings that they come from the family, they have the size and the genetics. Physically, they're there, and he's still the first one at the facility and the last one to leave, right? They put all that together. When you see that, what are some things that point out to you? Coach Kevin, this kid's he's gonna be different. We can take him pretty far. We could push him. He will respond and handle more of a load. What are some things what are some indicators that this kid will go further? Then how far will you push and take them if you can?
Well, one of the things that you find out really quickly is are there limitations athletically, and physically?
Sure.
I mean, the kid who's 5'3" or 5'4" is not going to be an NBA basketball player. There are things that the kids have to have, in order to feel like he's got that potential. So, as a strength coach, you get to where you understand what kids need physically or how far they need to go physically in order to compete at the next level. So, that becomes invaluable in terms of, kind of guiding kids in the right direction. But from there, I really think that, as a strength coach, you have that opportunity to let kids know that it isn't just about you being a great high school player, with that particular type of kid. You've got to compare yourself to the level that you aspire to. So are you working in a way that's going to allow you to compete collegiately or professionally? Because it's not a faucet you just turn off and on. Okay, once I get to college, I'm going to start working. Those guys at college, well, if you're a male, those are men, 18 to 23 years old, that you're going to have to compete with. Are you readying yourself now for that? Just like, with the girls I work with, you want to compete in the SEC, Big Ten in basketball. Is your strength level, is your athleticism such that you're going to be able to play as a freshman? Or are you automatically going to have to redshirt? So are you working right now in a way that's going to prepare you for that? So for me, it's, you find these kids that are very talented, and you realize that there are things that they need to understand, that they just fall within the crowd and compare themselves to the kids that are around them, but they compare themselves to how good they can actually be. And, you challenge them with things. Okay. Don't just get excited about making this club. Get excited about the fact that, this is a goal that you could potentially reach. This is what the average, if you're a lineman, this is what the average Big Ten lineman looks like.
Right.
Do you look like that yet? And so I think you share with them what the next level is. You also talk to them about, how they stand out mentally, because, hey, if you're going to be that good, you also going to have to develop leadership skills. So how are we going to develop that? Are the athletes around you going to see you as a leader? If you're always cutting up and you're playing around, you're not working that hard because you don't have to, because it comes naturally. Are they going to follow you? Are you going to be able to bring the rest of the team with you? Are you going to be as noticed if the team isn't as good? So even if it was, selfishly, people who are on championship type teams get noticed more than ones that aren't, because for a couple of reasons, because they get more exposure, but also because, colleges feel like they were able to bring other people along with them. And that's the kind of person that they'd want to recruit. So, yeah, I enjoyed working with that type of kid. But the thing that's nice about a high school strength coach is you get to work with that type of kid, but you also get to work with the kind of kid who high school is the only thing they'll ever do. But you're able to teach them those life lessons as a part of being a part of sport at that level. So, within that same room, you've got a kid who, you're going to explain how you're learning life skills by only ever being a JV player, never really getting to play varsity, but you're going to, go on to be successful in life because you learned how to do this, to the kid who, potentially could be making millions of dollars someday as an athlete. But, both of them have, needs that you need to make sure that you exploit by, approaching it the right way.
That's very true. Only 7% play college sports and 2% play D1. So the lessons are still applicable. Like I have some guys in my gym because, they've gotten in trouble. They're not allowed to play high school sports anymore. But there's still lessons to be learned, and their parents want them to learn some physical lessons, how to be stronger, how to be in shape. So if you're not on a team, then all that, how do you interact with others? How do you follow leaders? How do you lead folks? How do you strain under pressure and pain and adversity? You miss all that, so then you don't develop those mental muscles. And only 7% play college sports, so the other 93 are still populating the rest of the world, and having those lessons are huge. The thing about the leadership, it's really, it's hard for me. It's hard for a lot of folks because we have Mickey Marotti on from Ohio State, and I asked him, what are some components of being a good leader? He says you must be seen, so that when everyone sees you, that you're doing the right things. You must be heard, so that what comes out of your mouth is what the coaches are putting into you guys. So you are reiterating the coach's messages, so you're on the same page. But even if you just do those first two things, you're only compliant. You're just doing what you're supposed to do. So then he says you must be felt. So you must be seen, heard, and felt. And the felt is that some people, you connect with people emotionally and push them along or pick them up, and they get them better. And if you can combine those three components, now you're having people lead. Well, it's never been popular to say, hey, don't go out drinking. Hey, we're playing the next night. Hey, don't be up until 4. Get off your phone. Quit screwing around. It's never been popular to be that guy, whether you're 50 years old or today's kids. And a lot of people don't want to be even seen as a try hard, right? Oh, I'm a try hard. Oh, I don't want to be seen that. No one tell me about that. I think it's probably even a little bit harder now for these kids to become leaders because it's increasingly unpopular. What do you think about that?
Well, I think for quite some time, the kid who did things the right way, it's like they came up with terms a long time ago. I mean, it was brown noser and,
Yep.
all these other things. It
Yeah.
was,
Kiss
uh,
ass, teacher's
yeah.
pet.
So, I think that's been going on, for quite some time. But, I think if you run your program the right way, that you make being a leader something that kids are striving to be, just like, with our football co-captains. Our kids want to be a co-captain. We've got every year 10 or 12 kids think they should be the co-captains. But there's only a few that we pick because those are the ones that rise to the top. So I think on some level, kids understand if you do it the right way, what the right things are to do. And, in our program, I didn't really see kids, getting chastised about working hard, about doing the
Nice.
right things, about staying after to pick up the plates. I mean, those were all things that, that we said were a part of being a team and doing things the right way. And we wanted our leaders to be the ones that pick up the dummies on the football field, to carry the basketballs. It's not just about, oh, you're just a freshman, you take care of it. We did things where when kids first start with us, we take the older kids to teach the younger kids because we want to develop leadership skills. We also want them to feel like these are kids that I need to develop. So later on, you're not picking on them, you're trying to bring them along.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you develop the right culture, within a program, then it leads to kids thinking it's okay to do those extra things and feeling good about being acknowledged for that. I didn't see a whole lot, of that. Oh yeah, you're just working hard, kind of thing. In fact, we saw the opposite. Kids wanted to do that, but I think a lot of it is kind of how you present that. Because if you present it in a way to where you embarrass the kid, where it's kind of like, okay, he did this, whatever, but you can do it in a way where maybe you're talking to the kid one-on-one, but there are certain things that you read. We got an email from a teacher that said he did this. Let's everybody, this is making our program look good. You can present it in the right kind of way, then it's not a bad thing to be that kid that stands out because he's working hard, he's helping other people, he's picking up some kid's books or whatever it is. And so, I think if done the right way, you develop a culture that it encourages those things.
People ask, what is the number one? Hey, what's the number one thing we have in our gym? You have 24 squat racks, blah blah blah. No, number one asset's always going to be the culture, because you can make plenty of progress with great equipment or shitty equipment, and if you have that piece, it just keeps everything moving along, especially when things aren't that fun. I like to watch Hard Knocks, and there's Larry Fitzgerald. He's in his last year. He's a Hall of Fame receiver. He's carrying out the bag that has all the receivers' balls, right? And he's getting warmed up for practice, and it's during the COVID year, so he had the mask on, so he's carrying everything. And he's a Hall of Fame receiver, he's the complete veteran on the team. Or you read about the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team, and one of their mottos one of their tenets is sweep the sheds, meaning after every game, home or away, they leave that locker room as good or better than how they found it, right? Doing all those little things. And it becomes, when I tell people, those habits are life and death. And they'll say, well, come on, Jim, that's bullshit. I said, no, you're not going to die today if you don't do these things. That's not it. However, how you decide to do this, build this habit today and reinforce it week after week, game after game, gets ingrained in your identity of who you are, and then that shapes the rest of your life. So it's not life or death, but it shapes the rest of your life and your trajectory. So that culture of constantly putting out and doing all the little things matters. And then it's going to matter when your wife has cancer, or your kid is sick, or you get fired from your job because they have cutbacks. Like, all those things are huge, huge, huge lessons. And you're right, culture is going to be the number one thing. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how Indiana compares strength and conditioning wise, sports wise, versus the Midwest or the rest of the country. Some areas, the South has great results. Out west, there aren't as many. It's more rural, so it's a little bit different. Talk about Indiana, how it compares.
Well, when we developed the National High School Strength Coaches Association, back in 2016, we looked at how membership grew and so forth. And what we found was that Indiana was right at the top in terms of number of strength coaches per high school from any, compared to any state in the country.
Awesome.
And I think a lot of that, has to do with, what we talked about earlier, that, I was fortunate. I got in there. We were successful. Other people copied. And so it's become something to where many schools throughout the state of Indiana have the strength class during the school day. They have a strength coach. They've built bigger weight rooms. And so as a result, it's just kind of like the gyms in Indiana, where they're bigger than they are the rest of the country. But we've been successful with it.
They're pretty nice.
So, it's when we go to conferences out east, you go to New Jersey, and when we first started, we couldn't find a director for New Jersey because there were only 2 or 3 strength coaches in the whole state. So it was there are places throughout the country that still haven't caught up, but Indiana has been very much ahead of the game. And if you look at the weight rooms, the sizes of them, you look at, like I said, allowing kids to take care of it during the school day in the strength class. You look at designated strength coaches as opposed to the football coach being there in the weight room. Indiana is way ahead of the rest of the country. Texas does pretty well. Georgia does pretty well. And another couple that aren't too bad. But, if you compare it in terms of how many do we have compared to how many, schools are in the state, I put our mark up against anybody.
That's awesome. That's great. Strength cures a lot of sins if you're not very good at sports, because you're going to at least be somewhat athletic, right? And it just gives you that huge competitive advantage. The other thing I noted here on 2 different questions about working with people or being a better strength coach or building your knowledge base, all I see here is avid reader, right? And you can see this is just a fraction of the books in our library downstairs behind us. But I want just right off the bat, like, what are some authors or books that you're big on for sports psychology or leadership or personal development? Because we're always looking to get people better. Kaizen is one of our core values at the gym, which means trying to get 1% better in everything that we do. Talk about being an avid reader or listening to podcasts or books on tape. Like, what are some of your go-tos?
Well, when I first started in strength and conditioning, I felt the need to read everything I could on the X's and O's, so to speak, sports science,
sure,
exercise science. So it was flexibility, it was nutrition, and so forth. But as I got into it, especially at the high school level, I found that, this is how I talk about high school strength and conditioning. The analogy I use: if you have an entire house, house is on fire, you got to get out. You got to take the things that are most valuable to you that you can fit in one suitcase. That's what you take out. To me, that's what strength and conditioning is like. The house is all the things that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
The suitcase is what you actually use when you work with a high school athlete.
Okay.
Just the most important things. So by finding that out quickly, I realized what I needed to be studying were the other things. The leadership, the motivation, the personal development. I need to have something on, in my brain that when a kid comes up to me and said, I'm struggling with this, that I've got an answer for it, or I've got the right kind of question to lead them to the answer for it. So I just started reading everything I could. It started off with sports psychology. Then it was like, okay, as I'm reading sports psychology is how you deal with relationships, how you deal with my kids, with my wife, with family, with colleagues. And so I realized that personal development carries over to everything you do in life.
Mm-hmm.
So I started reading more, as I branched out, whether it was anything that had to do with like self-help, personal development, and so forth. And, I got to where, I would say the last 5-6 years at least that I was teaching, that I was reading about a book a week. And, I counted like how many I'd had really. I've read over 1,000 books since I started working there. I left like 500 of them for the next strength coach. I packed away about 150, and I've given away, some other ones. But I really think that reading as opposed to listening, you learn more.
You do.
Because you're seeing it. I think highlighting the important things takes another level of repetition.
Yep.
I think taking your highlights, and I used to type them up into a Word document, because by having to take it and paraphrase it, it was another level, another repetition. and then reading it and then sharing it with other coaches. But then once I got to, it was a few years ago, I started on Twitter and realized that, okay, I can reach more people by starting those highlights, put a little post, kind of a comment each day, and started doing it that way. So I think reading, again, book in hand, as opposed, I tried the online version, for a while, but it just didn't feel the same.
Sure.
So book in hand, reading as opposed to listening, highlighting, and then having to put it somewhere else allowed me to it was much further ingrained in me, but it also, by doing those things, I'm able to share some of the knowledge with other people. So, I think that's important. But, when I look at authors, I like the John Gordon stuff. He's written a lot of really good stuff.
Yep.
Pat Williams used to write a lot of really good stuff. There's a guy that's, I've read recently, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who's written a couple of really good books, Live Your Future Now and The Gap in the Gain, which, I think are great for anyone to read. And I quote those all the time. There's a book that was put out not too long ago. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's Arete. I think it's Arete or something.
Arete, yeah.
It's like a 1,000-page book, but he condenses about 70 or 80 books within that, and it's like a thought a day type thing, because the sections are very short, so somebody can read it in pieces if they want to, as opposed to all at once. But to me, once you start in on those books, and you're buying it, Amazon sends you, that, okay, if you like this, you probably like this, where you can start, finding other ones. And, as you share with a group of people that that read that type of thing, then when they find it, it's like, hey, here's a good one, I'll look into. And it becomes much easier to kind of continue to find those other resources. But, for me, it was just like, I'm ordering books all the time.
Yeah, my wife actually reads more than I do. She doesn't really read about the improvement books or mindset or things like that. So hers are all U.S. battles. So a lot of Civil War, a lot of World War II. She just loves all the history, U.S. history, but still a big reader. And similar to you, since I'm trying to impact people and make them better mentally and physically, I would do the same thing where I was writing it down. I would highlight it and then I just underline, and then I'd write these things down on Microsoft OneNote. So I'll have the books that I really like, I'll have them outlined in there. What I found the next iteration for me was, if I could share this quote or this habit or this tactic, like I like James Clear's Atomic Habits quite a bit. I quote that book all the time on how to change some people's habits. If I can then share that with someone, well, now I really, darn it, I know the material. So if I read it and highlight it and then write it down and then share it, then I know it. So then I have recall. Then after a few years of just doing it, people would ask me some questions, and I'm like, well, it says right here. So if you don't believe me, well, here's a smarter guy than I am. You'll at least believe him, right? And if I can bring 5 or 6 of those together, it kind of lends credibility. And I find it just fun to learn how you can improve. I just wish I were, younger, so I could do more of it. When you're talking about the suitcase, what I see is a lot of people, me included, loves the new bells and whistles. Hey, I need to have this new monitor in my car so that it attaches to my phone so that the map is there and I can put up different music on the car. I like all the new gadgets. And there's the velocity-based training gadgets in people's weight rooms. And I'm like, you know what? For these kids that have never really done much, junior high and then high school, it almost doesn't even matter what I have them do, because they're so at the bottom that I can have them just doing Jim Wendler's 5-3-1 or a basic 5x5 program, and they'll have results for a good 18 months. So what is in Kevin Vanderbush's suitcase as the house is on fire in the weight room? What are the main ingredients for you guys?
Well, we developed something early on, given the variables that we had. Okay, we knew, like in our strength class, that we're only going to have 35 minutes of working time. So as a result, we came up with a system where, okay, we can't do a total body program. And, if the athlete's participating in sport that day, whether it's competition, whether it's practice, that kind of dividing things up would really be more conducive to allowing them enough recovery time. So we came up with a split routine. 2 days of upper body lifting, 2 days of lower body lifting. Volume not being so high that it negatively affects them, but high enough to where they're going to see results. But we also felt like it was really important that we have 1 day per week that we're developing athleticism. So in that 1 day, we came up with a routine that did some basic plyometric jumping, in place jumping, repeat jumping. We did some basic footwork ladders, some movement type skill. We did some basic medicine ball where, the kids are throwing on one leg from a seated position, from a lunge position, and so forth. So the athleticism piece, I think, is huge for taking what you've got in the weight room and converting it to athleticism. I think a strength program that doesn't also have at least 1 day where they're working on movement skills or power skills, I think is missing out. And really some of what I feel like I develop on that athleticism day, to me, takes the place of what some people are trying to do in the weight room with some of the velocity-based type, philosophies. So for me, 4-day split routine during the school year works well for us. Having stations where a kid's at a station for 7 minutes, got 7 minutes to get 3 sets in, we'll rotate, makes use of the equipment, easier to supervise, but also, it changes it up a little bit. Even if they do the same workout, they're doing it starting at different stations each week. So the way that they work through it is different. Some days you may start on bench, but some day bench may be at the end of the lift. So that gives them some variety, but also challenges them in different ways. So for me, having a basic foundational program lifting-wise and having a basic foundational program athleticism-wise that is repeated over and over again is something I would never give up. I don't feel, when I first start that Wednesday workout in the first week, it takes me 3 weeks in class to teach them all. And then we can do all of it in the same day. So I'm not going to keep throwing new things at them all the time. I want them to go in there. I want them to jump higher. I want them to react quicker to the ground. I want them to be more explosive. But I don't need to change up the activities all the time. I would just want them to change their abilities to do it well. And so, and I think that they find somewhat comfort in knowing that, okay, this is the routine. Now let's see if I can do it better. Let's see if I can move my feet faster. Let's see if I can, throw the ball with more power. And so for me, some of the givens are keeping things simple. I do presentations. I'll show a slide that's got Baskin-Robbins 33 flavors. Then I'll have another one that shows chocolate and vanilla. People look at my program and they think it's chocolate and vanilla as opposed to, all those different flavors. But what I have found is that by allowing a kid to understand how much weight he should put on a bar in a particular lift and knowing when he's improved and always being able to use enough resistance, because when they start something new, they don't use enough resistance because they got to figure out where they are.
Yes.
But by keeping it the same and keeping it simple, it allows them to see consistent progress. And to me, a lot of what sport is mastering the mundane. Yep. So rather than saying, okay, I'm going to change what I do because kids, just don't have the attention span or whatever it is, I'm going to teach them that the basics, the fundamentals, the scales on a piano, are something that even the masters work on. And so we're going to keep it simple. We're going to change it up in the summer. We're going to go to total body routine 3 days a week. We can do some different things after school when we're working on higher volume, and we can make some changes there. But my base program is something that I'm sold on needs to continue. Needs to be that we develop that foundational strength, that foundational athleticism before worrying about, all of the extra bells and whistles. So we have a 5-station routine that hasn't changed. So when we order equipment, we just replaced all the equipment a few years ago in the room. We only have 5 squat racks because on our lower body day, there are 5 stations. There's 5 power clean platforms. There's 5 squat racks. There's 5 places where they do a single leg deadlift. There's 5 hack squats. There's 5 boxes where we go through a single leg progression. We're doing a modified pistol squat, an overhead split squat, and so forth. So I have 5 of each. Okay, so 5 times 5, there's 25. Okay, 2 kids per. You can fit 50 kids on that side of the room. I don't need a whole bunch of extra racks because they rotate around. Everybody gets the opportunity to use them.
Right.
But by doing this, they're getting all 5 stations in. They're getting explosive lift. They're getting an overall lift. They're getting, one where we're working on hamstring, and the same thing on upper body. So I can fit 100 kids in my room with only 5 squat racks, with only 5 benches, with only 5. So, that to me also is is huge in terms of, I wouldn't get rid of that. I mean, I wouldn't go to. I mean, I would struggle when I go and do, different things at places where like I walk into the room and there's like 30 squat racks and nothing else. It's like, okay, well, you're going to have to use these 5 for power clean. You're going to use 5 for squat. You're going to use these 5 for bench. Kind of working out that way.
There's a couple big principles right there. Whether, like my prior world at JP Morgan, there's the compound interest effect of investing or time value money if you're borrowing. And then in the athletic world is the compound interest effect of incremental improvements physically, right? And if you're constantly changing the movements, then you stop that compound interest effect a little bit. It takes neurologically for the kids and adults to learn the movements. And then if you just do it once, the next time is already going to be better. And the third time is going to be better than that. And that law of diminishing returns doesn't really kick in for a good while. You're not going to plateau for a good long while. So there's no real need to change. You're right. I say you got to be able to make love the boring, or the mundane like that. So, but if you can, they call it the fundamentals for a reason. If you can just not give a shit that say, hey, we're just doing the same thing. I know what I did last week. I know what I did here. I did 4x10 at 50-pound dumbbell overhead press. I'm going to try to get 4x11, or I'm going to try to get 4x10 at 55 pounds. You know where you're at, so you know what you can probably try to build the next time. If you're always changing it, well, I don't know. I haven't built up a baseline yet, so I got to figure that out. It's I find it to be a challenging sell, but I think it has the most impact of just beating on those things that give you that big compound interest effect. Huge, huge, huge. You can make so much progress with a barbell, kettlebell, some bands, the basics,
Yep.
Yep. So where are you working out now? Do you have your own gym set up at home, or how's that looking?
Well, in my son's house, fortunately he put enough room to where we've got 4 pieces of cardio equipment. I've got a rower. I've got an actual kayak machine.
Okay.
He's got a Peloton. He's got a treadmill. And then, we've got a set of dumbbells by 5 up to 75. I've got, bench press, incline dumbbell. And, I also have a, weighted vest that, pull-up bar and, some other things like that. So I've got enough to, at close to 66 years old, keep fit here.
Yeah, man.
It's nice having it in the basement,
Sure.
where it's just like you go there and you take care of it. Because I don't think I could handle heading to the gym. After 40 years of having my own weight room in high school, working out in the morning before anybody got there, going into a crowded facility and, dealing with some of the things that you deal with there.
Right.
This doesn't fit me. And so, this will work well for me.
Is there kayaking in the future? On the docket for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I paddled out of Eagle Creek consistently, and as I moved up here to Westfield, it's a little bit further away. So I'm going to have to find, public access on Morrison, that type of thing, which is something I'm looking into right now, possibly White River. But I mean, at Eagle Creek, I went out pretty consistently 5-6 times, a week in summer, 6 miles at a time. I enjoy it. I mean, it's the kind of thing I can do from spring to fall.
Something I love to do that I'm kind of terrible at so far because I don't have built up the reps because I like fishing. So do you ever just drop a line off the back of your kayak when you're just paddling along, see if you can snag something along the way?
The kayak that I have, you wouldn't do that with. I mean, it's one that if I put you in it, you'd fall out right away. I mean, right. It's a very narrow boat, and it took some while to learn the balance as a youngster. And I've found that by putting other relatives in it, that they can't even take a stroke without falling out. So it's not one that's designed for that. I mean, it's just wide enough for your hips. I mean, you get up to when you go 6 miles straight, I'm about 6.5 miles per hour kind of thing. So I mean, scooting along, So it's more of for fitness for. Sure. That than it is just kind of leisurely.
Yeah, you're working. You're trying to make some hay there. I get it. I always like to wrap up with a couple things, just kind of rapid fire questions. When you're listening When you're training, what would you like to? What do you usually listen to?
Classic rock.
All
But
right.
the interesting thing with that is that at Ben Davis, that's what we listen to because I felt like they need some background noise.
Yep.
But they don't need something they're going to sing to or dance to. So, and just the words.
Right.
It's like once you put filters on, a lot of the modern music wouldn't play anyway. So the whole time I was there, I mean, kids got to where they didn't even ask. It was going to be classic rock, and that's what it is. And I've seen kids that have been out 10, 15 years talking about, every time they hear Thunderstruck or something like this, they feel like they should be in the weight room. So,
Love it.
Yeah.
One of our main coaches, he coached at Plainfield. Oh, not coach. He was a PE teacher for Plainfield for 30 plus years. Rob Rigdon, and so whenever he is coaching some of our athletes, always starts with AC/DC and classic rock. So, what's a bucket list adventure for you and your wife? Something you haven't done yet?
I'd kind of like to go to Australia. It's one of those things that I've never done before. It just seems like it would be interesting. And for me, going to a place where language is not an issue. I mean, still speak
Nope.
English. It would be an interesting vacation, I think.
Mm. I haven't left the country much at all. However, that's the one place I've been. It was for a work assignment. I was there, I don't know, 10 days, and it's 14 hours just from California to get there. Awesome things to see. Awesome experience. Awesome. Favorite sports movie?
I would say, if I had to pick one, I mean, I like Remember the Titans. To me, it was high school sport. It was, dealing with the issues you deal with kids at that age. It, dealt with, kind of race relations at the time. So it was kind of a history type thing. It showed, different ways of challenging kids and developing leaders. So for me, I could relate to a lot of it,
Yeah.
and, it's kind of one of I'm the type that, when I watch movies, it's for escapism. I mean, I want it to end well. I'm not there to see some kind of drama that, it doesn't have a happy ending.
Right.
I'm going to see the good guy win.
Right. I tell people, I got conflict all day long. It's me versus my own workout. It's me versus the bar. It's me versus the music. It's me versus my coach. Sometimes me versus the kids, trying to push them along, pull them along. I have enough conflict. I'll listen to some smooth jazz on the way home, and I'll watch something completely mindless. You put on Step Brothers any time of the day, and I'll watch that, just to relax. How about your favorite sport to watch?
I don't have one. I mean, it's like I as an athlete, it was always what was in season.
Yep.
And it's still that way. So, I do say that I enjoy watching college athletics more than I do professional. And I like being able to watch a sport where, one of my former athletes is participating. So I'm more likely to, I've gotten one that's, is a second team All-American at Northwestern in softball. So I'm going to follow softball. So it's more about, following people I know than it is about, any particular sport.
My brothers and I, growing up, we would watch everything. So we would have been watching Wimbledon this past weekend. We'll watch the Olympics. It was back in the day when they had wide world of sports. So whatever came on, we'd just watch any of it. How about like favorite? I get the knowing you kind of follow your athletes because there's identity, there's a connection. You want to see how they're doing. How about a favorite pro athlete to watch or college athlete?
For me, it's like, again, I'm going to look at the athlete beyond their athleticism.
Yep.
What they stand for. The athletes who I see that, they like to compete, but when you hear about them off the field, they are in relationships that are steady relationships. They are, people with, Christian background. There are people who help younger kids. There are people who are role models. There are people who are willing to share what they've earned, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I look to like Lauren and Drew Holiday. Lauren was actually one of my athletes. Was Lauren Cheney. Not where, they're giving money to Black-owned businesses. They're donating a number of things that they've got, even though they make a lot of money. Those are the kind of athletes that, I appreciate. Utilizing the resources that they have in a positive way.
There's a my wife and I we call that nerding up the sport or the activity, or shows nerd up these battlefields that you find the background. So that's why kind of Hard Knocks is such a popular show, because you see these guys going through and they're getting cut, and then and they made it. And if you actually know the athlete, it's amazing. So if you read these autobiographies or biographies of these athletes, I just finished one this past week. It was called Fearless, and it wasn't for sport. The guy was a Navy SEAL, and they made sure that all his shortcomings were completely identified in the book. Big drug habits, 11 felonies. Parents said, "Hey, we're letting you get arrested. We're not defending you." Right? Turns it all around, and family, big Christian. He's at SEAL Team 6, the highest level for the military and the SEALs organization. Countless missions. He's one died in the line of duty, but he's over in Afghanistan, and he keeps bringing back on these deployments these sneakers and tennis shoes for these little kids, because they still have winter out there and they're in flip flops. So he just brings these shoes all the time to help these kids, So he's over there they're hunting bad guys, but he's trying to help these destitute folks at the same moment. So stories like that are like this. The adversity that they can overcome is really the attractive thing for me to watch and see. It's pretty cool. You got a favorite book or books? I got your authors.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of them, but I would say, to me, everybody should read The Gap in the Gain. And the idea in that book is that, throughout life, we always look at ideals. And many people struggle with the fact that where they are compared to what they'd like to be is a gap. And they focus on the gap, where they fall short, where they don't make as much money, what this relationship isn't good enough, whatever, as opposed to focusing on the gain in life, the positives. And I think he did a really good job of presenting that whole concept. And, I use that over and over again with people that, in teaching, you can either focus on where we don't make enough money. There's all kinds of extra things that we have to do. Or you can focus on the idea that I get an opportunity to make a difference every single day. I spent 40 years in an occupation where I felt like I really made a difference in those 40 years. So to me, The Gap in the Gain is a concept that everybody should, kind of really wrap their arms around.
If you have that approach, I got to believe you're happier. You're not as stressed. You're not as pissed. You're not as envious. And when I tell athletes and they say, well, I give them this little example that you've done this much work and you feel like you should be here on a comparable level, and maybe you're here and you're kind of pissed. Well, when you're doing this much work, like any other science experiment, you're making some assumptions and some calculations that this is what I need to do to be at this level, and we were just simply off by a little bit. You wanted to be at this level, and it turns out you got to do this much to get there. Okay, fine. So let's just reassess and get there. And it's that, what's that African proverb? The being envious is robs you of the joy of today, or something like that, versus just like we talked about before, focus on what you can control, your controllables.
And that same author wrote a book, Live Your Future Now, which to me is another really good one, where the concept being that, where do you hope to be someday? And if you have that in mind, then it helps direct today.
It does.
Because the only way that I get where I want to be, as I look ahead and, how I want to look back, is if right now I'm understanding and have a good conversation with my future self. People who have conversations with their future self or see their future self as somebody are much more successful than people that just, seat of the pants, live by the moment, as opposed to, where do I want to end up?
One of the guys we had on here was a 2-time All-American thrower from Ball State, and I asked him about nutrition. He says, I try to eat so that I'm happy about what I eat tomorrow. So I want to eat something today so that tomorrow I think, that was a good choice. I'm trying to, just a one-day future, which means I'm not going to have a big hangover tonight, so tomorrow I'm regretting it. Or I'm not going to eat a ton of fat and not enough protein, or a ton of carbs and not enough this, so that I'm regretting it. I want to eat today so that tomorrow, just one day, I'm feeling good about what I had yesterday. And it's just living that future, that one day, like right now. And what was cool about him, as you pointed out before, discipline's a big thing. This guy, Zach Riley, has been meal prepping for 14 straight years. And he's a PhD professor down at IUPUI, so he competes in Highland Games, at the master's level and across the country and across the world. And he's been meal prepping 14 years. 14 years. He's in his 40s. 14 years. That is so consistent and disciplined. That is amazing. How about like a favorite superhero? It could be comic book. It could be any kind of story. It could be any kind of movie. I don't care. It doesn't have to be comic book, but I always ask, what are your favorite superhero and favorite supervillain?
That's always a tough question for me, in part because, I don't look at any of the superheroes as having all the attributes that I felt like are important to have. But, I'm an old enough guy to where, when it started off, the only superhero was Superman. So I guess I'd have to go with that. And then as far as villain, when I put out that picture the student had me take where I was holding up 25 rings, they kept comparing me to Thanos, I guess, or I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it the right way. So I guess I'll have to go with that on the villain then. Because kids actually asked me about that. So we'll go with that.
For the longest time, I said my favorite hero would be Jim Thorpe. Indian, no money, and won everything in every sport wherever he touched. And then for villain, I said Hannibal Lecter. I just thought his mind was amazing to watch, but he's really kind of a messed up dude. But yeah. All right, you get to pick one lift in the gym. That's your favorite lift. What's that going to be for you, Kevin?
Probably bench. Bench has been the one that I've been able to determine, how strong I am and how much I'm losing with age.
Right.
And there's a certain amount that I could lift up until my late 40s that I thought I'd be able to do forever. And then once it's, late 40s, early 50s, I saw the decline.
Yeah.
Then it got to where it dropped to a certain point, but then it stayed there, and it stayed there for probably the last, 10 years or so.
Okay.
So it's kind of like always, I guess they use the term benchmark, but it's my benchmark for, how much am I losing as a result of just getting older?
Right.
So,
you have a favorite quote?
The thing I've always liked, the one is life is a grindstone, whether it wears you down or polishes you up depends on the stuff you are made of. So again, it goes with my philosophy that, we face a lot of adversity in life and really even should be challenged by adversity and put ourselves in adverse situations. And if you do that, you become a better person. Right. If you're made of the right stuff.
Yeah, confidence comes from reps. The more you want to have a glimpse of your future, show me the 5 people you hang out with, get comfortable being uncomfortable. Those are still the truisms of the day. And, Kevin, I'm really glad to have, met you. You're at the end of your, career at Ben Davis, but it sounds like you're still going to be making an impact going forward. So, thank you so much for your time today. I think you're still online somewhere. Where if people are wanting to connect with you and follow some of the content and information you put out, where can people find you?
Well, the only social media I had was Twitter. Well, I guess it's called X now.
Yeah.
And I would suggest that if you look at Coach Vanderbush on there, for about 3 years straight, I think about 1,500 posts, I put a daily thought for the day. Now, for me, it got to where it started being a little repetitive, because I'd have like 300 or 400 I'd go through, and it's like, wait a minute, I've already said that. But, for somebody that wants to, all I got to do is scroll back.
Sure.
But, I'm giving myself a little break from that because, I want to get re-energized, read some different books, have some different things that might approach that. But I think if you look back at those, there's an awful lot of good thoughts. Start scrolling back one a day, and you'll have about 3 years worth of thoughts that I thought were important enough to put out there.
That's awesome. My dad, I was in the late 80s. He bought me this book called The Edge by Howard Ferguson. He was a wrestling coach at St. Edwards.
Yeah, I had that book.
You had that book, right? And every page is like, well, that's another good quote. Well, that makes sense. I like that story. It was I got it on the shelf behind me. I love that book. All right, so we can find you on Twitter. For those that have questions for the show, you can continue to email us at info@athlete-builder.com. July 22nd is the big day. My first book goes on pre-sale, and it'll launch September 30th. Also alongside a digital course and planners that go along with it for athletes, so they can map out how to improve those 6 components for building athletes daily, so they can keep adding those inches up in that compound interest effect. So that's how you guys can get a hold of us. Kevin, thanks so much for the time today. Thank you for the generosity. Thank you for your wisdom and your patience and the impact that you're helping us today and everyone that we reach through this modest show that we do. We're just trying to help others get better. So you're continuing to do that, and we're lucky to have you on.
Enjoyed it.
Appreciate it, Kevin. Thanks so much.